Think about the last paycheck you received. Somewhere on that stub, there's an hourly number. And whatever it says, you know there's a legal line it can't fall below. You've probably never questioned that line. It feels as permanent as gravity. Here's the thing. For the first 162 years of American history, that line didn't exist. From the Declaration of Independence in 1776 all the way to 1938, there was no federal minimum wage. None. Not a floor, not a guideline, not a suggestion. An employer could legally pay a grown adult 10 cents a day, and the law of the United States had exactly nothing to say about it. And yet, somehow, this was the country that laid the railroads, raised the skyscrapers, and built the largest industrial economy the world had ever seen, with workers whose pay was set by nothing but what they could negotiate and what they could survive on. So what were people actually paid? How did a seamstress in New York make rent? What stopped a factory owner from cutting wages to nearly nothing? And what happened when nothing did? And why did it take until 1938 for the richest nation on earth to draw that line? This isn't trivia. What happened in 1938 rewired the relationship between the American worker, the American employer, and the federal government permanently. Every paycheck you've ever cashed lives downstream of it. The answer runs through a factory fire that killed 146 people, an elevator operator who went to court for the right to be paid less, a hotel chambermaid's $216 lawsuit that broke the Supreme Court, colonial laws that capped wages instead of raising them, a president at war with 9 judges, and a single silver quarter. So let me take you back to the beginning. Imagine you're a carpenter in Boston in the summer of 1630. The town is barely a town, a scatter of half-built houses on a muddy peninsula, and every one of them needs you. There are more roofs to raise than men who can raise them, and you've figured out what that means. You can charge whatever you want. 3 shillings a day, maybe more. The wealthy men running the colony are furious, so they do something about it. In one of its very first acts, the governing court of the Massachusetts Bay Colony passes a wage law, and it's a wage law designed to push wages down. Carpenters, bricklayers, sawyers, thatchers, capped at 2 shillings a day, with a fine for any employer who pays more, and a fine for any worker who takes more. Verify exact 1630 rates and fines against colonial court records. Sit with that. The first wage regulation on American soil wasn't a minimum, it was a maximum. Government stepping in to protect employers from workers with bargaining power. Hold on to that image. 300 years later, almost to the decade, the same instinct is going to come roaring back, pointed in the opposite direction. We'll get there. Those colonial caps eventually faded, and by the time the founders wrote the Constitution, government had walked away from the question of pay altogether. The document that organized American life says nothing about wages. Not a word. What filled the silence was an idea so deeply held it barely needed saying: liberty of contract. In plain English, your labor is your property, and a deal between a free worker and a free employer is nobody else's business. If you agreed to the wage was just. End of story. And in the early republic, that didn't feel especially cruel, because most Americans didn't work for wages at all. They farmed their own land. The hired hand who did might earn around $10 a month plus room and board. Verify typical 19th century farm wage against agricultural labor studies. Modest, but he ate at the family table and could reasonably dream of owning his own acres someday. Wages were a stage of life, not a life sentence. Then the factories came, and the whole equation flipped. Walk into a textile mill in Lowell, Massachusetts in the 1840s. The workforce is mostly young women, farmers' daughters recruited from the New England countryside. They're at their looms by 5 in the morning, 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, 70-plus hours, for a few dollars a week, minus deductions for board. Verify Lowell wage and board figures. Translate that into money you can feel. A Lowell mill girl worked nearly double a modern full-time schedule for take-home pay, worth well under $1 an hour in today's terms. And here's the uncomfortable part. By the standards of the time, Lowell was considered a good job. By the 1870s, for the first time in American history, most working people were employees, dependent on someone else's payroll. And when the economy crashed, as it did catastrophically in 1873, and again in 1893, there was nothing underneath them. Employers cut wages 10, 20, 25% at a stroke because they could. Workers struck, sometimes violently. Federal troops were called out. But the law's answer to how low can pay go remained what it had been since 1776, as low as someone, somewhere, was desperate enough to accept. Into this world stepped 2 people who decided that answer was a moral failure, and, more importantly, decided to do something clever about it. The first was Florence Kelley, a force of nature who had served as Illinois' first chief factory inspector, and then, in 1899, took over the National Consumers League. Kelley understood something her fellow reformers didn't. Courts would never accept a wage law for men. Liberty of contract was too entrenched, so she aimed for the seam in the armor. Laws protecting women and children, whom judges of that era were willing to see as needing protection. Get the beachhead first, expand later. The second was a Catholic priest priest and economist named John A. Ryan, whose 1906 book, A Living Wage, made the moral case in plain terms. A wage that can't sustain a decent human life isn't a bargain. It's a slow-motion injury, whatever the contract says. And orbiting Kelly's operation was a young social researcher named Frances Perkins. Remember her name. She's going to walk through this entire story, and by the end of it, she'll be standing somewhere no American woman had ever stood. The opposition, meanwhile, had a fortress. And in 1905, the Supreme Court gave it walls of granite. The case was Lochner versus New York Lochner. And it wasn't even about wages. It was about a New York law limiting bakers to a 10-hour day. The court struck it down. The 14th Amendment's protection of liberty, the majority reasoned, includes the liberty to make your own labor contract, and the government generally has no right to interfere. One sentence of plain English. The Supreme Court declared the freedom to strike a bargain a constitutional right, which made almost any law about wages or hours constitutionally suspect. The reformers kept probing. In 1908, in Muller versus Oregon, they won a crack in the wall. The court allowed a limit on women's working hours, swayed by a famous brief from attorney Louis Brandeis that buried the justices in evidence about health and exhaustion rather than legal theory. If hours could be regulated, Kelly reasoned, why not wages? In 1912, Massachusetts passed the first minimum wage law in United States history, covering only women and children, enforced by nothing more than publishing the names of employers who refused to comply. Wage setting by newspaper shaming, almost apologetic, but it existed, and other states were watching. The movement had its idea, its strategy, its momentum. What it needed, though no one would ever have wished for it, was a catalyst. It arrived on a Saturday afternoon in the spring of 1911, and it arrived in the worst way imaginable. It's about 4:40 in the afternoon, March 25th, 1911, near Washington Square in New York City. On the top 3 floors of the 10-story Ash Building, ASH, roughly 500 employees of the Triangle Waist Company, most of them Jewish and Italian immigrant women, many teenagers, are finishing their shift, sewing the fashionable blouses called shirtwaists. For this, the more experienced among them earn only a few dollars a week. Figures around $7 for well over 50 hours are commonly cited. Verify Triangle wage figures against Factory Investigating Commission records, which works out, in modern purchasing power, to something in the neighborhood of a few dollars an hour. The doors to one of the 9th floor stairwells are kept locked during working hours. The owner's stated reason was preventing theft. A fire starts in a bin of cotton scraps on the 8th floor. In a room full of tissue paper, fabric, and machine oil, it moves like a living thing. Workers on the 8th floor mostly get out. The 10th floor is warned by telephone and escapes over the roof. The 9th floor gets no warning at all. Women rush the locked door. The single flimsy fire escape twists away from the wall and collapses under the weight of the people on it. An elevator operator named Joseph Zito runs his car up into the smoke again and again, packing it with survivors until the heat and the bodies falling onto the roof of the car make it impossible. And then the crowd gathering on the sidewalk below watches something no one there ever forgot. Workers appearing at the 9th floor windows, silhouetted against the fire and stepping out into the air. The fire department's ladders reached only the 6th floor. 146 people died. Most were young women. Start to finish, it took about half an hour. Standing in that crowd was Frances Perkins. She'd been having tea across the square when the fire engines went by, and she ran toward the smoke. She watched people fall. Decades later, she would tell an audience that the New Deal began on March 25th, 1911. Keep that sentence in your pocket. We'll open it again at the end. The owners of the Triangle Waist Company, Max Blank, and Isaac Harris, were tried for manslaughter and acquitted. The jury couldn't be certain the men knew that particular door was locked at that particular time. Civil suits later settled for roughly $75 per victim, and it was widely reported that the owner's insurance payout exceeded their actual losses. Verify insurance and settlement figures. New Yorkers in 1911 read those numbers as an obscenity. But here's the detail that matters most for our story. The fire didn't just produce grief, it produced machinery. New York created a Factory Investigating Commission, run by 2 ambitious politicians named Robert Wagner and Al Smith, with Frances Perkins as a lead investigator, dragging legislators up ladders and into freezing canneries to see conditions for themselves. Dozens of state laws followed, and the minimum wage idea, that timid Massachusetts experiment, caught fire across the country. Oregon passed a law with actual penalties in 1913. Within a decade, more than a dozen states, plus the District of Columbia, had minimum wage laws for women on the books. Verify exact count of states by 1923. Every one of those laws, though, rested on a single load-bearing assumption, that when the Supreme Court finally ruled on the question, it would let them stand. In the spring of 1923, the court ruled. The case was Adkins versus Children's Hospital, and it arrived wearing a very strange disguise, a lawsuit by a worker demanding the right to be paid less. Willie Lyons was a 21-year-old elevator operator at the Congress Hall Hotel in Washington, D.C., earning $35 a month plus 2 meals a day, a job she said she liked. Verify Lyons' wage details against case records. Washington's minimum wage board had set the legal floor for women in her line of work at $16.50 a week, which was more than the hotel paid her. The hotel told her that rather than raise her pay, it would have to replace her, likely with a man, since men weren't covered by the law. So Willie Lyons sued to have the minimum wage struck down, arguing it had cost her the job she wanted. Now here's what most people don't realize about that case. Willie Lyons almost certainly didn't wander into federal court on her own. Her challenge was engineered, a test case with legal firepower aligned with the employers fighting the law. Verify details of how the litigation was arranged. Her situation wasn't fake. She was the sympathetic face chosen for a much bigger fight. When you want to kill a law, you find the one person it genuinely hurt. It worked. In April 1923, the Supreme Court struck down the D.C. minimum wage, 5 votes to 3. Justice George Sutherland's reasoning had a bitter irony baked into it. Women had just won the vote in 1920, he noted, so the old justification for treating them as needing special protection was gone, and therefore their liberty of contract deserved the same iron shielding as men's. A minimum wage, he wrote, simply forced employers to hand over money regardless of the bargain. Even the conservative Chief Justice, former President William Howard Taft, dissented in disbelief. And just like that, the entire beachhead, 2 decades of Florence Kelley's strategy, was gone. State minimum wage laws were struck down or quietly abandoned as dead letters. Worth pausing on what was lost, that $16.50 a week works out, adjusted for a century of inflation, to roughly 300 of today's dollars. Call it around $7.50 an hour. Hold that thought. The number will feel familiar later. For the rest of the 1920s, the floor stayed dead, and while the economy boomed, few people missed it. Then the economy fell through the place where the floor should have been. You know the broad strokes of the Great Depression, the 1929 crash, banks failing by the thousands, 1 in 4 workers unemployed by 1933. Less famous is what happened to the people who kept their jobs. With desperate replacements lined up outside every factory gate, wages entered a death spiral. Pay envelopes shrank by 1/3 or more. Verify aggregate wage decline figures. The sweatshop, which reformers thought they'd killed after 1911, came back from the dead. State investigators in the early 1930s found garment shops paying young women a few dollars a week and in the worst cases effectively a few cents an hour. Verify specific investigation findings. If you want to see the bottom of an unregulated labor market, come to San Antonio, Texas. Some 12,000 workers, most of them Mexican-American women, sat in dim, crowded sheds, cracking pecans by hand, paid by the pound, around 5 or 6 cents per pound of shelled nuts, which for many meant $2 or $3 a week. Verify pecan sheller pay rates. Translate that. For a full week of work that split fingertips and filled lungs with nut dust, in rooms with brutal tuberculosis rates, take-home pay with the modern purchasing power of roughly $50 or $60, not per day, per week. In 1938, thousands of those shellers walked out in a strike led by a 21-year-old organizer named Emma Tenayuka, and were met with tear gas and mass arrests. Remember the pecan sheds. They have one more painful thing to teach us before this story ends. Roosevelt took office in March 1933 promising action, and among his first moves was a radical experiment, the National Industrial Recovery Act. Industries would write codes of fair competition, including minimum wages, typically $12 to $15 a week, and businesses that signed on hung a Blue Eagle poster in the window, "We do our part." For the first time, the federal government was putting a number under wages, and it worked, at least initially, at least partially. The race to the bottom slowed. Then came the chickens. The Schechter brothers ran a kosher poultry business in Brooklyn, and the government charged them with violating their industry code, including, among other things, the sale of an unfit chicken, which is why the newspapers gleefully called it the sick chicken case. In May 1935, a unanimous Supreme Court used it to strike down the entire National Industrial Recovery Act. Congress had handed away too much lawmaking power, and the Schechter's chickens, having come to rest in Brooklyn, were no longer interstate commerce for Congress to regulate. Roosevelt fumed to reporters about the court's horse and buggy understanding of the modern economy. A year later, the court went further. In June 1936, it struck down New York's minimum wage law for women, 5 to 4, meaning the states couldn't act either. Roosevelt said the court had created a no man's land where no government, state or federal, could function. Even many Republicans winced. Their own 1936 platform endorsed state wage protections for women and children. Think about where things stood. It is 1936. The country is deep in a shattering depression. Sweatshops are paying pennies, and the Supreme Court has ruled in effect that no minimum wage, federal or state, can constitutionally exist. Every door is locked. Which brings us to the confrontation this story has been building toward, one of the most dramatic constitutional collisions in American history. In November 1936, Roosevelt was re-elected in a landslide almost without precedent. 46 of 48 states, 523 electoral votes to 8. In January 1937, he stood at his second inauguration and described what he saw. 1/3 of a nation ill-housed, ill-clad, ill-nourished. And then, on February 5, 1937, he dropped the bomb. Roosevelt proposed legislation letting him appoint an additional Supreme Court justice for every sitting justice over the age of 70 who declined to retire, up to 6 new seats. The press instantly had a name for it, the court-packing plan, aimed squarely at the aging conservatives the papers called the 9 old men. It was a declaration of war on the court by a president at the height of his power, and it detonated in his face. Newspapers howled, his own party split, even loyal New Dealers recoiled. If this president could stack the court, so could the next one. But while the country argued about 9 old men, the actual turning point was already in motion, and it belonged to a chambermaid. Her name was Elsie Parrish, a grandmother in her mid-30s who cleaned rooms at the Cascadian Hotel in Wenatchee, Washington, for around a quarter an hour. Verify her exact hourly pay. Washington state still had a women's minimum wage law on its books from 1913. Under it, she should have been paid $14.50 a week. When she left the job, she did the math on what she was owed and asked for it, $216.19 in back pay. Verify exact amount. The hotel offered her $17 to go away. She refused, found a local lawyer, and sued, a claim worth, in today's money, roughly $5,000, against a Supreme Court precedent that said she was owed nothing at all. On March 29, 1937, with the court-packing fight at full boil, the Supreme Court handed down West Coast Hotel versus Parrish. 5-4, it upheld the Washington law and overruled Adkins. Chief Justice Charles Evans Hughes wrote the sentence that buried an era. The Constitution does not speak of freedom of contract. The deciding vote came from Justice Owen Roberts, who only months earlier had voted the other way in the New York case. Washington wits promptly coined one of the great one-liners in American legal history. It was, "The switch in time that saved 9." And here's the fascinating detail most people overlook, the one that complicates the legend. Roberts actually cast his vote in the Parrish case at the justices' private conference in December 1936, weeks before Roosevelt announced the court-packing plan. It's important to say that recent scholarship, legal historians like Barry Cushman, argues Roberts' shift grew out of the legal arguments and his own doctrinal reasoning, not presidential intimidation, though others counter that Roosevelt's crushing November landslide was pressure enough all by itself. So the tidy story, FDR threatened the court and the court blinked, is partly a myth. But the myth mattered because everyone believed it, and the court's direction never reversed. The court-packing bill died in the Senate that summer, leaving Roosevelt badly bruised. Then the oldest conservative justice retired, and Roosevelt filled the seat with Senator Hugo Black of Alabama, the lead Senate sponsor of a minimum wage bill. Roosevelt had lost the battle. He had absolutely won the court. The constitutional door now stood open for the first time since 1776. All Congress had to do was walk through it. That walk would take more than a year, because the men blocking the doorway were members of Roosevelt's own party. In May 1937, Roosevelt sent Congress a message declaring that a self-respecting democracy could offer no justification for the existence of child labor and none for starvation wages. And behind the message stood a bill that Frances Perkins, now Secretary of Labor, the first woman ever to sit in a president's cabinet, had been carrying in one form or another for years. The Fair Labor Standards Bill proposed 3 things at once: a federal minimum wage, a maximum work week with overtime pay, and a ban on child labor in covered industries. The Senate passed it that summer, and then it hit the wall, the House Rules Committee, where a coalition of Republicans and Southern Democrats simply refused to let it reach the floor. Understand why the South fought so bitterly, because it's the honest, uncomfortable center of this story. The Southern industrial strategy was cheap labor. Mills had migrated south for decades precisely because wages were dramatically lower, and a national floor would erase that advantage overnight. Beneath the economics lay something uglier, a wage system built on paying black workers less than white workers, which some Southern congressmen defended openly on the House floor. A single federal minimum threatened that entire racial arrangement. This fight was never only about economics. The bill's House champion was Mary T. Norton of New Jersey, chair of the Labor Committee. In December 1937, she pried the bill out of the Rules Committee's grip using a rarely successful maneuver called a discharge petition. get 218 members to sign, and the bill goes to the floor whether the committee likes it or not. She got the signatures. The House then voted the bill back into committee anyway. Verify December 1937 recommittal vote count. Washington wrote its obituary. The minimum wage was dead again. What resurrected it wasn't a speech. It was an election. The twist nobody in Washington saw coming. In Florida, Senator Claude Pepper faced a May 1938 primary against a congressman campaigning hard against the wage-hour bill. Pepper wrapped himself in the bill and dared Florida's voters to punish him for it. On May 3, 1938, they gave him a landslide instead. Verify margin. The message landed in Washington overnight. Even Deep South voters, the ordinary ones, not the mill owners, wanted the floor. 3 days later, Norton filed a fresh discharge petition, and this time members physically lined up down the aisle of the House chamber to sign it. The 218 signatures that had taken weeks to gather in December were collected in roughly 2 hours and 22 minutes. Verify the timing detail. The dam hadn't broken, it had been voted away. Now slow down and watch the ending in detail, because it moves fast. The House passed the bill by a wide margin in late May 1938. Verify final vote counts. Conference negotiators spent June hammering out the North-South fight, refusing formal regional wage differentials but paying for Southern votes another way. We'll get to the cost in a moment. Congress sent the final bill to the president in mid-June. On the evening of June 24th, Roosevelt gave a fireside chat urging Americans not to be frightened by what he called calamity-howling executives predicting ruin. And the next morning, June 25th, 1938, working through a stack of roughly 121 bills before leaving Washington, verify the count, he signed the Fair Labor Standards Act into law. No grand ceremony, a signature in a pile of signatures for a law that outlived nearly everything else on the desk. Here's what it did when it took effect on October 24, 1938. Minimum wage, 25 cents an hour, rising by steps to 40 cents over 7 years. Standard work week, 44 hours, dropping to 40 by 1940, with time and a half overtime beyond it. And child labor in covered industries, banned under 16, hazardous work off limits under 18. The first durable federal child labor ban in American history. Coverage reached only industries touching interstate commerce, roughly 1 worker in 5. And government estimates suggested some 300,000 people were due immediate raises, with over 1 million more getting shorter hours. Verify coverage and impact estimates. 25 cents, a quarter an hour. About $11 for a full week, roughly 5 to 6 of today's dollars an hour. The floor was ankle height, but for the first time in 162 years, it existed. It was federal, and it never went away. Now the cost, the moral ledger of this story, stated plainly. To win passage, the bill's authors excluded whole categories of workers, farm laborers, domestic servants, and broad swaths of retail and service work. Those exclusions weren't random. Agriculture and domestic service were precisely where the majority of black workers, and enormous numbers of women, earned their living, and everyone involved understood that arithmetic verify estimates of the share of black workers excluded. The floor of 1938 was real, and it was a floor with people deliberately left standing outside it. Congress didn't begin correcting the exclusions until the 1960s and 70s, and echoes of them survive in the law today. One question remained: would the Supreme Court let it live? In February 1941, in United States versus Darby, a Georgia lumber case, the answer came back unanimous. 9-0, the court upheld the entire act and formally buried the era Lochner built. The constitutional argument that had strangled wage laws for 4 decades was over. Not narrowed, ended. After that, the floor only ever ratcheted upward. 40 cents, 75 cents, $1 by 1956, on and on. The American argument permanently changed shape, from whether a minimum wage should exist to how high it should be. It has never changed back. And were the opponents wrong? Partly, and partly not. And this is where we keep our promise to the pecan sheds. The catastrophic industrial collapse the bill's enemies predicted never came. But in San Antonio, the companies responded to the 25-cent minimum exactly as economists would predict. They bought shelling machines. Within a few years, the hand-shelling jobs, the very jobs Emma Tenayuka's strikers had fought to make bearable, largely ceased to exist. Verify employment decline figures. That's the trade sitting inside every minimum wage debate since. A floor can raise the wage and eliminate the job, and economists, famously David Card and Alan Kruger on one side of the modern argument, their critics on the other, are still measuring where the balance falls. Anyone who tells you the answer is simple, in either direction, is selling something. When you zoom out and look at the whole arc, 1630 to 1938, something remarkable comes into focus. Remember that Boston carpenter? The first American wage law was a ceiling, written because workers had too much power. The law of 1938 was a floor, written because workers had too little. 3 centuries apart, opposite directions, but the same underlying conviction. The one liberty of contract tried to deny for 162 years, that the price of an hour of human labor is never just a private bargain. It's a public question. The only thing that ever really changed was who the law was protecting. And remember Frances Perkins, frozen on that sidewalk in 1911, watching the Triangle workers fall? When Roosevelt asked her to become Secretary of Labor in 1933, she brought a list of conditions: a 40-hour week, a minimum wage, the abolition of child labor, and told him she'd take the job only if he backed them. The Fair Labor Standards Act was that list, signed into law. When she said the New Deal began on March 25, 1911, she wasn't being poetic. She was telling you in one sentence that the fire and the floor were the same story. Hers. That quarter an hour is also still with you, by the way. The next time a 25-cent coin passes through your hand, consider that within living memory, that coin was the officially declared value of 1 hour of an American's work. And that before 1938, even that had no guarantee at all. Because this story runs straight into your wallet. Today's federal minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. Set in 2009, now the longest stretch without a federal increase since the floor was created. Curiously close, you might notice, to the modern value of that $16.50 a week the court struck down in 1923. 30 states have set higher floors, the federal tipped minimum sites at $2.13, and the same debate runs on, one side pointing to the cost of living, the other to small businesses and those shelling machines. Whether the world before 1938, freer in one sense, far more brutal in another, was better or worse than ours, depends entirely on what you value. Liberty of contract was a real freedom for people with options. For people without them, it was often just a polite name for powerlessness. The law changed in 1938. The question underneath it never has. Who decides what an hour of a human being's life is worth? And what happens to the people who have no power left to bargain with? That question is as alive in every wage debate today as it was in the pecan sheds of San Antonio. If this story changed how you see the numbers on your own paycheck, subscribe. This channel is for people who want to understand the hidden systems that quietly shape your world. The rules underneath the rules, how they were really built and who they were built for. That's what we do here. Every video, in depth. And if a 25-cent hour surprised you, wait until you see what American children were legally doing for work before that very same law of 1938. That story is coming next, and you will not want to miss it.